On February 18, 1847, 7 men moved across the snow on homemade snowshoes, carrying everything they had left. Their animals were behind them, back at Mule Spring, where the drifts had grown too deep for horses to push through. From that point on, the rescuers had continued on foot, each man bearing a pack estimated somewhere between 50 and 75 pounds. Dried beef, flour, the weight of every meal they hoped to deliver. The leather straps pressed into their shoulders with each step. The snow gave and resisted at the same time, the way deep cold snow does, sinking slightly before it held. The air was sharp and still. The sound of their movement was muffled, padded, almost private. This was not the end of the Donner Party ordeal. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Most people who know the name Donner Party know the broad outline. A wagon company caught in the Sierra Nevada during the winter of 1846 and 1847, snowbound above 8,000 feet, stranded long past the point where they could help themselves. That part of the story, the entrapment, the cold, the desperate decisions made inside those shelters, is the part that tends to stay with people. But what happened next is a different kind of story, and in some ways a harder one to hold in the mind, because reaching those camps required not one crossing of those mountains, but four separate expeditions, each one organized in the California settlements below, each one climbing into the same range under different conditions, with different people and different supplies, confronting whatever the previous journey had left behind or failed to accomplish. Historians have always called them the first, second, third, and fourth relief. The numbering is simple. What the numbers contain is not. The 7 men approaching Truckee Lake on that February morning were the first relief. They had left most of their provisions cached at Mule Spring, intending to pick up the survivors on the way back down. What they were carrying now was enough to make first contact, to show the people in those shelters that someone had come, that the outside world still knew they were there. The snow around the lake was deep in the way Sierra snow gets in late winter, not soft, but compressed and dense and vast, shaped by wind into surfaces that held a man's weight for one step and swallowed his leg to the knee on the next. Moving through it took a particular rhythm, a commitment to each placement of the foot, a patience that the cold made harder to maintain. None of the 7 men that day knew exactly what they would find. They had heard reports. Survivors of an earlier escape group had staggered into the settlements in January, bringing the first direct word that people were still alive up in the mountains. 7 of them had made it out, after weeks on the trail without enough food, moving on their own improvised snowshoes through the same passes these rescuers were now crossing in reverse. Their survival had confirmed what the settlements already feared, that the camps held more people than could save themselves, and that winter had no intention of releasing them early. So the first relief had organized, gathered animals and flour and dried beef, and started east into the mountains. By the time the horses could go no further, the men had strapped on snowshoes and kept moving. By February 18th, they were close enough to the lake to see what they had come for. What they could not yet see, and what the story of that winter keeps insisting upon, is that their arrival would not close anything. It would set something in motion. The first relief would bring survivors back down to the staging camp at Mule Spring, but not all of them. The people who could not travel, or were too weak, or too young, would remain, and the conditions those people faced when the next party arrived would be shaped by what this first crossing had and had not been able to do. Each relief journey, it turned out, created the circumstances the next one would have to enter. That is the honest question underneath this story, not simply whether rescuers reached the camps, but why it took 4 separate crossings to bring out the people still alive, and what each journey meant for everyone still waiting. The 7 men in the snow that February morning were the first answer, and the question had only just been asked. The reports that sent them there had started moving in January, slowly, through settlements that were not yet certain what to believe. Johnson's ranch sat in the low foothills east of the Sacramento Valley, close enough to the mountains to serve as a stopping point for wagon companies coming off the Sierra passes, far enough below the snow line that the ground there in January was wet rather than frozen. The air smelled of mud and wood smoke. Cattle moved in the fields. It was the kind of place that felt ordinary and solid in a way the mountains directly to the east did not. And in the third week of January 1847, that contrast would have been very sharp indeed. Somewhere between January 18 and January 20, 7 people arrived there on foot. They had come down out of the Sierra, and the condition they were in told the story before any of them could speak it clearly. Weeks in the mountains without adequate food, improvised snowshoes made from oxbow frames and strips of hide, cold that does not stay on the surface of the body, but works its way inward, into the joints, into the thinking. By the time they reached the ranch, the group was reduced and exhausted in ways that are difficult to describe without reaching for words that are too large. They were simply people who had survived something that had not been designed to be survived, and they were only barely on the other side of it. These 7 were what remained of a larger group that had set out from the mountain camps in December, trying to cross out of the Sierra on foot before the winter could deepen further. The group had started with 15 people and had moved through conditions that erased the boundary between day and effort. They had crossed the high country. They had lost members along the way. And they had finally descended into the foothills and walked into Johnson's ranch, carrying the only thing of immediate value they still possessed, direct knowledge of what they had left behind. That knowledge was the first real information the California settlements had received from the mountain camps since the emigrants had stopped being able to move on their own. What the 7 survivors could say, once they were warm and fed and capable of organizing their memories into words, was this: people were still alive up there. They were sheltered, or sheltered enough, in camps near Truckee Lake and at a second location called Alder Creek, roughly 6 miles from the lake, where the Donner families had been separated from the main group by a broken wagon axle and had made their own camp when the snow arrived. 2 locations, 2 concentrations of survivors, 2 sets of conditions that any rescue party would need to account for separately. The lake shelters and the Alder Creek camp were not the same problem. They were 2 problems that happened to share a mountain. Beyond that, the picture the survivors carried was imperfect in the way that information always is when it travels through suffering. They could say that people were alive. They could not say exactly how many, because the mountain winter had been doing its work since November, and they had left before it was finished. They could not provide a reliable count of the dead, or a clear accounting of how much food remained, or a precise description of who among the stranded was still physically capable of walking out with assistance, and who was not. They knew the general shape of the catastrophe. The specific measurements of it were still somewhere up in the snow. This was the information that began moving westward from Johnson's ranch in the days that followed. Not a complete intelligence picture. Not a roster of survivors with their conditions noted beside their names. Just the essential and urgent fact: there were people in those mountains, in 2 places, and they could not get out by themselves, and winter was not finished. The California settlements of that period were not large or well organized in the way that would make assembling a mountain rescue party straightforward. Sutter's Fort, the central hub of the Sacramento Valley at that time, had resources and a degree of institutional capacity, but the scale of what was needed: men willing to cross the Sierra in February, animals that could carry provisions as far as the snow line, and enough food to supply both the rescue party and the people it hoped to bring back, required coordination across ranches, settlements, and individuals who had their own obligations and their own reasonable hesitations about walking into the Sierra in the middle of winter. The hesitations were not unreasonable. The same mountains that had trapped the emigrants were the ones the rescuers would have to enter. The snow that had stopped wagon wheels in October was still there in January, deeper now, and the passes were not passable by horse or mule through much of the range. Any party that went in would have to do part of the journey on foot, carrying its own supplies, knowing that the route to the camps was longer than the point where animals could follow. What the settlements were being asked to do, in other words, was not simply send help. They were being asked to send people into the same conditions that had made help necessary in the first place, with the understanding that those people would need to be self-sufficient enough to get there, deliver what they carried, and bring survivors back out, and that the survivors would include people who could not walk, or could barely walk, and would need to be managed somehow across miles of deep snow. The news from the mountains had arrived. The question now was what the foothills could actually produce in answer to it, and how quickly, and in what form. At Johnson's ranch, and at the settlements nearby, people began gathering what they had. What they had was not an organized storehouse waiting to be opened. It was cattle in the fields, wheat that had not yet become flour, leather that had not yet been shaped into useful gear, and horses belonging to people who could not know when, or whether, the animals would return. Before anything could be carried toward the Sierra, ordinary materials had to be turned into provisions for an extraordinary journey. The work began close to the ground, beside fires, animals, sacks, and rough wooden equipment. Beef was killed and cut for travel, then dried over heat and smoke so that it would keep longer and weigh less than fresh meat. The process required time and attention. Wood had to be gathered. Fires had to be maintained. Pieces of meat had to be exposed to enough heat to dry without being wasted. Smoke settled into clothing and hair, and the smell of the preparation would have carried across the damp air of the ranch. This was not food prepared for comfort. It was food reduced to its most useful form. Every unnecessary ounce mattered, because the provisions would first travel on animals, and later, once the snow became too deep, on human backs. The dried beef had to sustain the men going into the mountains, and, if they succeeded, help feed people who had been living with almost nothing. No one yet knew how many of those people would be able to leave, how many would need to be supported, or how long the return might take. Wheat also had to be made ready. In Eliza Donner Houghton's later reconstruction of the preparations, grain was ground at a hand mill, a slow and physical process that turned stored wheat into coarse flour. The sound would have been steady and repetitive, stone working against grain, the mechanism turning by hand, the flour falling below in small amounts. It was not the silent opening of a barrel already filled. Someone had to stand there and produce it. Some of that flour was placed into sacks for the journey. Some was baked into bread before the party left. Bread offered an immediate ration that required no mixing or cooking on the trail, while flour could be carried farther and prepared later if fuel, time, and weather allowed. Each form had advantages, and each had limits. Bread could harden. Flour could become damp. Both had to be protected from rain, snow, and the constant movement of packs. The account comes from Houghton many years afterward, and it should be understood that way. She had been a small child in the mountain camps, not an eyewitness standing at Johnson's ranch while these supplies were assembled. Her description is a later reconstruction drawn from the history of her family and the people involved. But the practical details fit the needs of the expedition closely. Beef had to be preserved, wheat had to be ground, flour had to be bagged, and food had to be made portable before men could carry it into winter country. Animals were gathered as well. Horses could carry more than a man and could move efficiently through the lower foothills, where the ground was wet but still open enough for hooves. They could transport sacks of flour, dried meat, blankets, clothing, and equipment toward the higher country. Yet everyone preparing the expedition understood at least one important limitation. The horses would not carry the supplies all the way to Truckee Lake. That meant the load had to be organized in stages. Materials useful on horseback might become useless once the animals stopped. Packs had to be arranged so that they could eventually be lifted from a saddle and placed on a man's shoulders. Food could not simply be piled together. It had to be divided, balanced, wrapped, and protected well enough to survive mud, water, and snow. Pack saddles were made or adapted for the purpose. Leather was handled while still damp from the winter air. Straps were tested. Loads were shifted from one side to the other until they sat evenly enough not to injure the animals or spill along the trail. None of this had the appearance of a formal military supply operation. There were no specialized mountain rescue units waiting nearby, no standardized equipment issued from a government depot, and no established winter road across the Sierra. There were instead settlers and volunteers working with the tools, animals, food, and experience available to them. Their preparation was practical, because it had to be. A poorly fitted saddle could rub an animal raw. A flour sack tied badly could be lost in a stream. Meat that had not dried properly might spoil. A load that leaned too far to one side could slow the entire party or force a stop in cold rain. The apparent abundance of the ranch could therefore be misleading. Cattle stood in the fields. Wheat could be ground. Horses could be gathered. Fires burned and men moved between supplies that seemed substantial while they remained spread across the working ground. But the mountains would compress all of it. Only a portion could be placed on the animals. Only a portion of that could be carried beyond the point where the animals failed. And from that reduced quantity, the rescuers would have to feed themselves, provide something to the people in the camps, and support a return party whose size and condition remained unknown. This was the hidden calculation inside every sack and strip of dried beef. The men could not simply carry as much as possible, because heavier loads would slow them in deep snow. They could not travel lightly, because arriving without enough food might place rescuers and emigrants in the same danger. They needed blankets and clothing, but every blanket added weight. They needed provisions, but provisions consumed the strength required to move them. No exact inventory could solve the deeper uncertainty. The reports from the mountains had described survivors, but not the full condition of those survivors. The volunteers did not know how many people might be able to stand when they arrived. They did not know how much food remained at Truckee Lake or Alder Creek. They could estimate distance, but winter altered distance. A mile through open foothills was not the same as a mile through snow that held the legs at every step. Even the date of departure has come down with a small uncertainty. Later accounts place the first relief's departure on neighboring days in early February. It is safest to leave the precise day unsettled. What matters here is the sequence. By early February, the beef had been dried, the wheat ground, the flour sacked, some bread baked, pack saddles prepared, and horses gathered. Men had agreed to go. The ranch behind them still held smoke, livestock, stored grain, and the solid forms of ordinary life. Ahead, the road rose gradually toward a country where those things would become harder to find and harder to use. At first, the horses could carry the burden. At first, the ground still showed through. Then the party moved east from Johnson's ranch, and winter began changing the road beneath them. The firm stretches gave way to water. Rain darkened the leather. Streams rose across the route. Hooves sank deeper into the mud, and every mile toward the Sierra made the carefully prepared loads feel less like an answer, and more like a question the mountains had not yet agreed to accept. The first resistance came not from snow, but from water. Rain followed the party into the foothills, settling into coats and blankets, darkening the straps of the pack saddles, and softening the ground beneath the animals. Trails that might have carried horses easily in dry weather became slow channels of mud. Hooves pressed through the surface and sank. Each animal had to pull itself free before taking the next step, while the loads above shifted with the movement. The rescuers had prepared for cold, but wet weather created its own kind of exhaustion. Clothing grew heavier. Leather softened and stretched. Flour had to be kept covered. Dried beef had to remain protected from the water running from blankets, clothing, and packs. A load did not need to fall into a stream to be damaged. Hours of steady rain could work its way through seams and wrappings, turning useful supplies into weight that could no longer be trusted. The men moved beside horses and mules carrying the food and equipment gathered at Johnson's ranch. There were sacks of flour, dried beef, blankets, extra clothing, packs, and the homemade snowshoes that would be needed farther ahead. For now, those snowshoes were cargo. They rested among the other supplies while the animals did the work. That arrangement made sense in the lower country. A horse could carry more than one man, and every mile traveled under animal power preserved the rescuers' strength for the higher mountains. But the road was already showing how temporary that advantage would be. Waterways that might ordinarily have been crossed without much thought were swollen by winter rain. Cold water moved across the route, sometimes shallow enough to wade, sometimes broad enough to slow the entire line while the men searched for a safer passage. Animals entered carefully, feeling for the bottom beneath moving water. Pack saddles creaked as the current pressed against legs and loads. Men watched the flour sacks, the blankets, and the dried provisions, knowing that a stumble could cost more than time. Once across, there was seldom a clean place to rest. The banks were wet. The trail beyond was often softer than the trail before it. Mud clung to hooves and boots, and in some places the animals sank deeply enough that forward movement became a repeated act of recovery. Pull, pause, regain balance, then pull again. The rescuers could not hurry through such ground. Speed would only increase the chance of an animal slipping, a saddle turning, or a pack breaking loose. They had to move at the pace allowed by the weakest footing and the most heavily burdened animal. This was rescue measured not in dramatic leaps, but in small corrections, tightening a strap, lifting a sack away from wet ground, guiding a horse around a deeper patch, stopping long enough for an animal to recover its breath. Above them, the sky remained gray. Ahead, the foothills continued to rise. The route toward Bear Valley and Mule Spring carried them gradually away from the settled ground behind Johnson's ranch. The signs of ordinary California life became less frequent. Fields and ranch buildings gave way to wooded slopes, narrow passages, and water moving down from higher elevations. The air cooled as the party climbed, though the rain remained rain for a time. This middle country was neither the open ranch land they had left nor the deep winter landscape waiting above. It was a place of transition, and every part of the expedition was changing with it. The animals still carried the burdens, but less efficiently. The men were still walking on exposed ground, but patches of snow began appearing in shaded places. Water ran beneath leaves and across the trail. The surface underfoot shifted from mud to frozen earth and back again. At first, snow appeared in separate remnants, lying beneath trees or along the colder side of a slope. Then the patches widened. The spaces between them narrowed. Hooves moved from wet soil onto crusted snow, then back into mud where the surface had thawed. There was no single depth that described the route. Winter had laid snow unevenly across the Sierra. Wind, elevation, trees, sunlight, and the shape of the land all changed what the rescuers encountered. One stretch might allow the animals to proceed with care. Another might hold them deeply enough to demand help from the men walking beside them. The important change was not a number. It was the gradual loss of dependable ground. As the snow became more continuous, the animals could no longer place each hoof on a firm surface. A crust might support part of their weight and then break. A horse would step forward, sink, and struggle to bring its body through. The load above it shifted downward and sideways. Harness and leather moved against wet hair. The rescuers steadied the packs when they could, but every correction required effort, and every effort slowed the party. The animals were doing exactly what the expedition required of them, but the country was becoming unsuitable for the work. Horses and mules had brought the flour, beef, blankets, clothing, packs, and snowshoes far beyond the ranch. They had carried the weight through rain and swollen water, across mud that gripped their legs, and into the first serious snow. Yet the deeper the party climbed, the clearer the approaching limit became. The men could see it in the animals' movement. Steps shortened, breathing became more labored. Progress that had once been slow but regular became uncertain. A loaded horse might advance only a few feet before sinking again. Each pause allowed cold to settle into damp clothing, but movement demanded more from animals already working near the edge of what the ground permitted. This was the quiet difficulty of the western approach. The rescue party had not yet reached the people it had come to help, but it was already consuming strength, time, and supplies merely to move the supplies into position. The journey did not begin at the snowbound cabins. It began here, with rain running from blankets and mud holding the legs of loaded animals. Still, they continued upward. The homemade snowshoes remained tied among the equipment, but their meaning had changed. At Johnson's ranch, they had been preparations for a distant problem. Now they were evidence of what the party would soon have to do. The rescuers had known that the animals could not cross the entire range. Knowing it in advance, however, was different from watching the usable trail disappear beneath them. By the time they approached Mule Spring, the expedition's original form was close to its end. The horses and mules had carried the provisions as far as the winter country would allow. Beyond that point, the loads would have to be reconsidered. Food would need to be divided. Supplies would need to be cached. What had rested on pack saddles would have to be measured against the strength of human backs. Rain had given way to snow, and the road had narrowed into something the animals could no longer reliably follow. At Mule Spring, the rescuers would stop trying to force the expedition forward in the shape it had taken from Johnson's ranch. They would leave the horses behind, lift the provisions from the saddles, and decide how much 7 men could carry into the mountains. At Mule Spring, the loads came down. The horses and mules stood in the snow, while the men loosened straps and lifted sacks from the pack saddles. Leather creaked in the cold. Flour shifted inside its wrappings. Pieces of dried beef, blankets, clothing, and equipment were set down and examined again, not as a single collection of supplies, but as a series of choices. The animals had reached their limit. Beyond Mule Spring, the deepening snow made continued travel by horse or mule impractical. The party could not solve that problem by urging the animals harder. A horse struggling under a load might exhaust itself, become injured, or trap the expedition in country where neither men nor supplies could move efficiently. The shape of the relief effort had to change. Most of the provisions were left behind in a cache. That decision could appear wasteful when viewed from the snow around them. Food had been prepared with care at Johnson's ranch. Beef had been dried. Wheat had been ground. Flour had been sacked. Animals and pack saddles had carried the loads through rain, mud, and swollen waterways. Now much of that work was being placed aside before the rescuers had reached the people it was meant to help. But the cache was not an abandonment of the supplies. It was an attempt to place them where they could still serve the journey. Mule Spring stood near the boundary between 2 kinds of travel. West of it, animals could be used. East of it, the rescuers would have to depend upon their own legs, their snowshoes, and whatever weight they could carry. The provisions left at the spring could support the return. If survivors were brought safely back across the higher country, they would arrive at Mule Spring exhausted and in need of food. There, the cached supplies would be waiting, and horses could once again take over part of the work. The same place that marked the end of mounted travel on the way in could become the beginning of mounted travel on the way out. That future purpose made the cache essential, yet it did not make the immediate decision easier. 7 men would continue from Mule Spring. Each had to take enough food to sustain himself through the crossing, and enough to offer the emigrants if the party reached them. Their packs, estimated at between 50 and 75 pounds, consisted principally of dried beef and flour. The weight was substantial even on firm ground. On snowshoes, where every step required balance, and where the surface might hold or give way without warning. It would become part of the landscape itself. The men had prepared homemade snowshoes for this point in the journey. Now they brought them down from the equipment, fastened them on, and adjusted the loads that would rest against their backs. The wide frames helped distribute weight across the snow, but they did not make walking effortless. They reduced the depth of each step. They did not remove the need to lift a heavy pack, place the foot carefully, and continue through cold air mile after mile. A pack weighing 50 pounds might be the lighter burden among them. 75 pounds could approach half the body weight of a smaller man. The straps pressed across shoulders already tired from the lower journey. Flour settled heavily against the back. Dried beef had its own hard, compact weight. Blankets and clothing added bulk even when they added less mass. Every item carried east had to justify the strength required to move it. More food meant a better chance of feeding the people in the camps. It also meant slower progress and greater exhaustion among the rescuers. Less food would make the 7 men more mobile, but it would reduce what they could safely distribute when they arrived. They were not packing for a known number of travelers. They were packing for people whose condition remained uncertain and whose ability to walk west had not yet been measured. The problem could not be solved perfectly because one side of the calculation was missing. No one at Mule Spring knew exactly how many survivors would leave the camps with the first relief. No one knew how much assistance they would require or how slowly they would move. A child, a sick adult, or someone weakened by months of hunger might consume little food at first but require time and physical support far beyond what a stronger traveler needed. The rescuers therefore carried not only supplies but uncertainty. Each sack represented an estimate. Each estimate would eventually meet a human being in the mountains. Around them, the animals remained with the equipment that could go no farther. The pack saddles, so useful through the foothills, had become reminders of a road that no longer existed in practical terms. Horses and mules could wait at the staging point. The 7 men could not. They organized the provisions left behind so they could be found and used later. Food had to be protected as well as possible from weather and animals. The party's return would depend upon recognizing the place, reaching it with survivors, and finding the cache intact enough to serve its purpose. For now, it stood as a promise made to a future group that had not yet begun its westward journey. Then the rescuers turned toward the higher Sierra. Their movement changed immediately. There was no longer a line of loaded animals pressing slowly through snow. There were 7 men, each carrying his own share of the expedition. Their world had narrowed to the distance between one snowshoe and the next. The pull of the straps, the sound of breathing, and the pale route ahead. The flour and dried beef that had seemed like provisions at Johnson's ranch now felt like resistance against every step. Yet leaving more behind would have meant reaching the camps with less to offer. The food slowed them because it mattered. Behind them, Mule Spring held the horses, pack saddles, and most of the expedition's supplies. Ahead were the summit and 2 separate destinations, the shelters at Truckee Lake and the Donner family's camp at Alder Creek, roughly 6 miles away from the lake group. The rescuers did not yet know what they would find at either place. They knew only that people had been reported alive, that the camps were separated, and that the food on their backs was the first substantial relief moving toward them. The 7 men continued on homemade snowshoes, rising farther into the winter landscape. With each mile, Mule Spring became more distant, and the possibility of an easy retreat diminished. The animals were behind them now. The cache was behind them. Ahead, beyond the summit, the figures described only in uncertain reports were waiting inside shelters the rescuers had never seen. The shelters appeared slowly against the snow. They were low, dark shapes at the edge of Truckee Lake, partly enclosed by the winter that had gathered around them. From a distance, the cabins might have looked almost absorbed into the landscape, their walls and roofs broken by drifts, smoke rising weakly into the cold air. After the open whiteness of the approach, Even that thin smoke was evidence of life. On February 18th, the 7 men of the First Relief reached the lake camp. For weeks, the people in California had known the mountain camps only through incomplete reports. Survivors remained somewhere near the lake. Others were farther away at Alder Creek. Food was scarce. Some people were too weak to travel. Beyond that, the details had been uncertain. Now the rescuers could see the conditions for themselves. The lake settlement was not one large building sheltering the entire party. It consisted of one cabin that had already stood there, and 2 additional makeshift cabins occupied during the winter. These structures offered walls, roofs, and some protection from the weather, but they had never been designed to hold so many people through months of deep snow and diminishing food. Inside, the air was close. Smoke from small fires lingered among damp clothing, blankets, and hides. Light entered weakly through openings in the cabins. The people who had waited there had spent much of the winter in confined spaces, moving carefully, preserving energy, and listening to the weather beyond the walls. Patrick Breen had recorded that winter in his diary. His entries do not need decoration. Their value comes from their restraint. Day after day, he noted changes in weather, the condition of the people around him, the decline of available food, sickness, and death. The diary preserves the passage of time from inside the camp, where one day of snow or wind could resemble the next, while the supply of anything edible continued to shrink. The record also documents the use of animal hides as food. Hides that had once served practical purposes had become one of the final materials available for boiling and eating. They offered little comfort and limited nourishment, but they represented something that could still be softened, divided, and consumed. By the time the First Relief entered the cabins, hunger was not a sudden event. It had become part of the organization of daily life. Food had to be measured against the number of people waiting. Strength had to be preserved for tasks that could not be avoided. Fires needed attention. Children and sick adults needed care. Snow pressed around the buildings, and every attempt to move outside required energy that could not easily be replaced. The arrival of the rescuers changed the camp immediately, but not completely. The flour and dried beef they carried represented real relief. For people who had been surviving on what little remained, the appearance of food from beyond the mountains was proof that the route to California had not closed forever. The 7 men themselves were proof that the Sierra could still be crossed, but they had not brought enough to end the problem in a single day. The packs that had felt so heavy beyond Mule Spring now looked limited inside the cabins. 7 men could carry only so much. The food had to support the rescuers, strengthen the emigrants, and remain available for the westward crossing. Giving too much at once might leave nothing for the trail. Giving too little might leave people unable to begin it. The rescuers also had to understand who could travel. Some of the emigrants could still walk with food and assistance. Others had been weakened by sickness, hunger, or months of confinement. Children might need to be carried or closely guided. Adults who appeared capable of leaving the shelter might fail after a few miles in deep snow. The conditions inside the cabins could be observed, but the true test would begin only after the party started west, and the lake camp was not the whole of the emergency. Approximately 6 miles away, the Donner families remained at Alder Creek. Their shelters were cruder than those beside the lake, consisting of tents and lean-to structures rather than cabins. The separation mattered. Food and information could not simply be distributed from one central place. Men had to account for distance, snow, and 2 groups whose conditions might not be the same. The phrase Donner Party can make the winter sound like a single camp and a single experience. In reality, the stranded emigrants had been divided by geography, as well as by family, shelter, health, and available supplies. The people beside Truckee Lake had lived one version of the winter. The families at Alder Creek had lived another, close enough to belong to the same disaster, but far enough away to complicate every effort to reach them. The First Relief had therefore arrived at one destination, without yet solving the second. Inside the lake cabins, however, the immediate task was clear. The rescuers had to distribute food carefully, learn what had happened since the snowshoe survivors had left, and decide how many people they could reasonably lead across the mountains. That decision could not be based only on compassion. It also required calculation. Every person added to the westbound group would slow the pace. Every slower mile would consume more food. Every weakened traveler would require attention from men already carrying packs and breaking trail. If the party became too large, the provisions might fail before Mule Spring. If it remained too small, people capable of leaving might be forced to wait for help that had not yet been organized. The rescuers could not take everyone. They also could not remain in the cabins indefinitely. The food they had brought was limited, and staying longer would consume the same provisions needed for the return. The mountains had allowed them to enter, but weather could change again. A route that was difficult on one day might become impassable after another storm. So the arrival on February 18th was both an answer and a new uncertainty. Help had reached Truckee Lake. The people inside the cabins were no longer entirely cut off from California. Food had crossed the summit. Men had come through the snow. But the relief party now faced the part of the journey that could not be prepared at Johnson's Ranch or calculated at Mule Spring. It had to choose who would leave, who would remain, and how much strength the westward road would demand from people who had very little strength left. The cabins had been found. The next task was to lead the first survivors away from them. Leaving required a different kind of strength from waiting. Inside the cabins, movement could be reduced to what was necessary. A person might shift closer to a fire, adjust a blanket, or cross a short distance between shelters. Outside, every step demanded balance, warmth, and food. The people chosen to go west were not simply walking away from the lake. They were entering a route that had already exhausted the men who had crossed it carrying provisions. The relief party organized the departure around what the emigrants could still do. Some could move with guidance. Others needed steady help through the snow. Children had to be watched closely. Packs had to be redistributed because the rescuers were no longer carrying food alone. They were also managing blankets, clothing, and the uneven pace of people weakened by months in the mountains. The westward group stretched out quickly. Those with more strength moved near the front or followed the path broken by the rescuers. Others advanced more slowly, placing each foot into the compacted track and pausing when the effort became too great. The snowshoes that had carried the 7 men east were now part of a more complicated procession, one in which speed could not be set by the strongest traveler. That change mattered. On the journey toward Truckee Lake, the rescuers had been able to measure progress by their own endurance. If one man slowed, the others could adjust. On the return, they had to measure every mile by the condition of the emigrants. A weakened person might move well for a short time and then lose strength suddenly. A child might need help over a drift that an adult crossed without difficulty. Wet clothing could become heavier. A blanket that offered warmth during a halt could become another burden once the group moved again. The food carried from the lake had to serve everyone. The rescuers could not distribute provisions without considering the distance remaining. A meal might restore enough strength for the next stretch, but too much used early would leave less for the higher route. Too little might prevent someone from continuing at all. The arithmetic that had begun inside the cabins now traveled with them, measured in portions, pauses, and the changing pace of the line. The mountains did not divide the journey neatly into rescue and return. The same snow that had resisted the rescuers on their way east now resisted the people they were leading west. The same summit had to be crossed again. The same long distances remained between the camps and the place where animals could finally help. Behind them, people still waited at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek. That knowledge traveled with the group as surely as the packs did. Those leaving had been selected because the first relief believed they had a chance of reaching California. Those remaining had not been forgotten, but the rescuers could not bring them all at once. The westbound line therefore carried both relief and incompleteness. Every person moving away from the camps was evidence that rescue was possible. Every person left behind was evidence that more parties would be required. Progress was slow enough that the landscape changed almost imperceptibly. A stand of trees passed. A slope was crossed. A place reached after hours of effort remained visible behind them for longer than expected. The trail was not a road in the ordinary sense. It was a narrow sequence of steps pressed into snow by people trying to preserve enough strength for the next sequence. At stopping places, blankets were gathered around tired bodies. Snow softened near small fires or beneath repeated movement. Clothing became damp, then cold again when the group resumed. The rescuers checked those who had fallen behind, adjusted loads, and helped people rise. The work was repetitive because survival often is. Lift, steady, wait, move again. There was no single moment when the group passed from danger into safety. Distance from the cabins did not guarantee progress. A party could be farther west and still lack the food or strength to reach the lower country. The true boundary lay ahead at Mule Spring, where the animals and cached supplies waited. Until then, the survivors remained dependent upon their own bodies and the 7 men guiding them. The closer the party came to Mule Spring, the more important that staging point became. It was no longer merely the place where the rescuers had left their horses. It represented a change in what the journey would demand. Beyond it, people who had crossed the higher snow on foot could be placed on animals. Supplies cached there could be used. The slow human line could begin to take another form. But first, the group had to reach it. By March 2 and March 3, 18 surviving emigrants brought out by the first relief arrived at Mule Spring. The sight of the animals changed the scene immediately. Horses meant that the weakest travelers no longer had to carry their full weight over every remaining mile. Animal warmth rose from damp coats. Saddles and equipment that had seemed useless in the deeper snow became valuable again. The transition was not effortless, but it was real. A person who had been moving step by step through the Sierra could now be helped toward a horse. Stiff legs had to be lifted carefully. Wet blankets were adjusted. Hands steadied bodies weakened by the crossing. The animals shifted under unfamiliar weight, their breath visible in the cold air, while the rescuers arranged the group for the lower journey. Mule Spring had fulfilled both purposes imagined for it. On the way east, it had allowed the relief party to leave behind what human backs could not carry. On the way west, it became the place where exhausted emigrants could transfer to horses, and where the journey toward Johnson's ranch became more manageable. The crossing was not finished, but its most difficult form had begun to loosen. Below Mule Spring, snow gradually gave way to wetter ground. The animals could move where they had previously stopped. The pace remained careful, and the people they carried were still weak, but the burden was no longer falling entirely on human legs. The first relief had reached the camps, delivered food, and brought 18 survivors as far as the waiting horses. Yet even as this group descended toward the foothills, the larger effort was already continuing elsewhere. The 4 relief journeys did not unfold like separate chapters with clean beginnings and endings. They overlapped. While one party was still guiding survivors west, another group was climbing east through the same country, carrying fresh provisions and a different set of hopes. Among the men moving toward the Sierra was James F. Reed. For him, the people still waiting in the mountains were not only members of an emigrant company. 2 of them were his children. Patty and Thomas Reed were still somewhere beyond the summit, among the people the first relief had not been able to bring out. That fact gave the second relief a personal center, but it did not reduce the practical demands of the journey. James F. Reed was returning as a father, yet he was also helping lead a party of 10 men into the same winter country that had already tested the first rescuers. The group needed food, equipment, and enough discipline to carry provisions east. without using too much of them, before reaching the camps. The men assembled with the knowledge gained from the first relief, though that knowledge was incomplete. They knew the route could be crossed on snowshoes. They knew animals could be useful only to a certain point. They knew people at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek remained in need. But they did not yet know how conditions had changed since the first rescuers arrived, how many people could now travel, or how much strength remained among those still waiting. The mountain would answer those questions only after the party entered it. As the second relief climbed east, the trail carried signs of the movement that had come before. Tracks marked places where animals had passed through the lower country. Snowshoe paths, when weather had not erased them, showed where men and emigrants had moved across the higher ground. Campsites and disturbed snow suggested pauses, transfers, and difficult decisions already made. This was no untouched wilderness corridor. It had become a narrow route of repeated effort, carrying food east and weakened survivors west. At some point along that route, the two movements came near one another, the first relief descending with people from the camps, and the second relief climbing toward those left behind. Even without a formal exchange, the image explains the character of the rescue better than a simple list of expeditions can. One group was returning from the mountain with proof that people could be brought out. The other was entering because that first success had not been enough. The landscape around them remained the same, but the direction changed its meaning. For the descending survivors, every mile west brought them closer to animals, ranches, food, and lower ground. For Reed and the 9 men with him, every mile east increased the distance from those resources. The worn trail beneath their feet was reassuring, because others had crossed it, but it also revealed how much physical effort the journey had already consumed. Cold wind followed the route uphill. Packs shifted against shoulders. Food had to be guarded from dampness. The men moved through places where the first relief had struggled with mud, water, and snow, but the second relief now carried an additional responsibility. It was not simply trying to reach the camps. It was preparing to bring out another group, one that might include Reed's own children. Patty and Thomas were not abstract names on a list of stranded emigrants. Their presence shaped the meaning of Reed's return in a way that could be stated without imagining his private thoughts. He joined the expedition. He led men toward the Sierra. He continued toward Truckee Lake. His actions show that family ties were part of the force driving the second relief forward. Yet family could also complicate judgment. A relief leader had to think about the whole party. A father had reason to focus on particular children. Those roles were not necessarily opposed, but they could pull in different directions when food, strength, and time were limited. If Patty and Thomas were capable of leaving, Reed would naturally want them included. If other emigrants were equally weak, the party would still have to decide how many people it could support on the return. The central difficulty had not changed since the first relief. Reaching the cabins created choices that the journey inward could not settle in advance. 10 men might appear to offer more strength than 7, but a larger rescue party also consumed more provisions. Every rescuer had to eat. Every pack had limits. Every person added to the westbound group would require food and attention. The apparent advantage of numbers had to be measured against the weight those numbers created. The second relief therefore moved with both greater knowledge and greater expectation. The first relief had proved that the route was possible. It had reached the lake, distributed food, and led survivors toward California. That success could encourage the next party to attempt more. But the mountain did not become easier because it had been crossed once. Snow remained deep. Weather remained uncertain. The people in the camps had endured additional days of hunger and cold. The trail itself may have offered guidance, but it could not guarantee the condition of the people waiting at its end. As the 10 men climbed, the lower country fell behind them. Animal tracks thinned. The air grew colder. Packs that had seemed manageable at the start became more noticeable with every ascent. Conversation, when it came, would have been shaped by breath and effort. with long stretches in which the sound of movement mattered more than words. The party continued east through the same corridor the first relief had used, but it was entering a changed story. The people coming down had carried news of who had survived the first evacuation. Reed was moving toward those who had not yet left. The balance of strength inside the camps was different now. Some of the more capable travelers were gone. Many who remained had spent even longer with limited food. That meant the second relief might reach people in greater need with no corresponding increase in what the rescuers could carry. Still, the 10 men pressed on. Their journey was not a separate beginning so much as the next movement in a continuous exchange across the Sierra. Food went east. Survivors came west. Information traveled in both directions, always incomplete and already aging by the time it reached the next group. By the final approach to Truckee Lake, Reed was no longer moving toward an uncertain report. He was moving toward a specific place and specific members of his family. On March 1st, the second relief reached the lake. Inside the shelters, Patrick Breen would record the arrival. Outside, the 10 men began unloading what they had carried, and somewhere among the people waiting in the dim cabins were Patty and Thomas Reed. Patrick Breen's diary fixes the moment with unusual clarity. On March 1st, James F. Reed's relief party arrived at Truckee Lake. For the people inside the shelters, the 10 men brought more than food. They brought evidence that the route to California remained open, at least for those strong enough to attempt it. The first relief had already passed through and taken one group west. Now another party had crossed the Sierra, carrying fresh provisions and the possibility of another departure. Cold clothing began to warm in the dim interiors. Packs were lowered. Flour and other supplies that had been protected through the mountain crossing were brought among people who had been waiting through additional days of winter. Fine dust could rise as sacks were handled, briefly visible in the low firelight, before settling onto rough surfaces and clothing. The cabins were crowded enough that every new arrival changed the available space. Men who had spent days moving through open snow now stood among families who had lived for months inside low shelters. Packs, blankets, bodies, and small fires occupied the same limited rooms. Movement had to be restrained. Food had to be distributed without confusion or waste. Somewhere in that close interior, Reed found Patty and Thomas. There is no need to invent words for the reunion. The documented facts carry enough weight. Their father had crossed back into the Sierra with the second relief. The children had remained in the camps through the winter. On March 1st, the distance between them finally closed. But the reunion did not close the larger problem. Reed had arrived as a father, yet the 10 men around him had come as a relief party. They had to consider everyone who might be able to leave, not only the 2 children Reed had crossed the mountains to reach. The supplies they carried belonged to the work of evacuation. Food had to strengthen people for travel, while remaining sufficient for the return. The rescuers therefore began the same difficult assessment that had confronted the first relief. Who could stand and continue standing after several miles? Who could walk only with support? Who might appear strong enough inside a cabin but weaken once exposed to cold, wind, and deep snow? Which children could move beside an adult, and which would require more direct assistance? These were not questions that could be answered from appearance alone. Months of limited food had affected people differently. A person might still speak clearly and move across a small room, yet lack the endurance to cross the summit. Another might recover some strength after receiving food. The rescuers had only a brief period in which to observe, ration, and decide. The number of men in the second relief could create a sense of greater capacity. 10 rescuers meant more hands to distribute provisions, organize movement, and help weakened emigrants. But those 10 men also needed food for themselves. They had consumed part of what they carried while coming east, and they would consume more on the westward road. Every additional emigrant changed the calculation. A larger group could bring more people out of the camps at once. It would also move more slowly. A slower party would spend longer between the lake and the lower country. using more food and increasing its exposure to changes in weather. People who needed to be carried or closely supported would draw rescuers away from breaking trail and managing supplies. The emotional answer was simple: take everyone who wanted to leave. The physical answer was not. The second relief could not erase the mountain's limits merely by arriving with determination. The Sierra still stood between the cabins and California. Snow still covered the route. Every person selected for evacuation would have to cross ground that had already exhausted experienced rescuers. Reed's children stood within that problem. Patty and Thomas would leave with their father, but their inclusion could not transform the expedition into a private family journey. 15 other emigrants would depart with them. Together, the westbound group would number 17, in addition to the rescuers guiding them. That was a much larger movement than the 10-man party that had reached the lake. The 2 days between arrival and departure allowed the relief party to prepare as much as circumstances permitted. Food could be divided. People could be observed. Blankets and clothing could be arranged for the cold outside. Those leaving had to understand that the relief party could guide and support them, but could not make the route easy. Inside the cabins, the difference between staying and leaving must have been visible in simple objects. A blanket placed around someone preparing to travel. Food set aside for the trail. Clothing adjusted for snow rather than the close interior of the shelter. A pack lifted and tested. For those remaining, the preparations carried another meaning. They would watch a second group leave while continuing to wait for assistance not yet present. The arrival of the second relief proved that more help could come. Its departure also showed that help still had to be divided into separate journeys. The mountain crisis could not be emptied in one movement. Outside, the shelters remained partly enclosed by accumulated snow. The path away from the cabins led toward the summit, and then down the western side of the Sierra. It was the same route the rescuers had crossed coming in, but the enlarged party would experience it differently. 10 men had arrived carrying provisions. They would leave responsible for 17 weakened emigrants. That change transformed every mile ahead. Food would disappear more quickly. The line would stretch farther. The strongest travelers would have to match the pace of the weakest. A delay affecting one person could slow everyone. The reunion between Reed and his children was complete in the simplest sense. He had reached them, but reaching them had never been the full purpose of the journey. He now had to bring them west, along with the others the party had agreed to take. On March 3rd, the second relief left the mountain camps with 17 emigrants. Patty and Thomas Reed were among them. The cabins receded behind the westbound line as the rescuers guided the larger group onto the snow. Fresh provisions traveled with them, along with blankets, tired bodies, and the expectation that food caches placed along the route would support their passage. The plan was reasonable. Move west, reach the caches, distribute what had been stored, continue toward the lower country. But 17 people weakened by winter could not move like 10 rescuers carrying packs. Their pace would be slower, their needs greater, and the margin between enough food and too little food much narrower. For the moment, however, the route remained open. The group moved away from Truckee Lake, and James Reed walked west with Patty and Thomas among the people following him. At first, the westward line held together. The rescuers moved among the 17 emigrants, keeping the group on the broken trail and watching for the first signs that someone was losing strength. The stronger travelers could follow the compacted track with some regularity. Others moved unevenly, advancing a short distance before stopping to recover their breath. Patty and Thomas remained within the larger company their father was helping guide. Around them were people of different ages and very different physical conditions. They had all left the same mountain camps on March 3rd, but they were not beginning the journey with the same reserves of strength. That difference soon shaped the movement of the entire party. A line of healthy travelers can adjust its pace and continue. A group weakened by a long winter must move according to the person who can least afford to hurry. Someone who had enough strength for the first hour might struggle during the second. Another might walk steadily until a slope demanded more than tired legs could provide. The rescuers could help one person over a difficult stretch, then turn to find that someone else had fallen behind. Packs had to be carried. Food had to remain protected. The trail ahead still had to be found and kept open. Behind the group, the tracks recorded their slow passage for only a short time. Wind moved loose snow across the surface. New flakes began settling into the depressions left by snowshoes and boots. The clear line leading back toward Truckee Lake softened until separate prints became shallow marks, and shallow marks became part of the surrounding white. The weather did not need to become violent all at once to change the journey. A gradual increase in wind was enough to make clothing feel colder. Wet flakes collected on blankets and shoulders. Packs absorbed moisture. The people at the rear of the line saw less clearly where those ahead had stepped. Progress continued, but it became less efficient. The plan depended upon reaching food caches placed along the route. Those caches were more than convenience stores. They were part of the structure of the evacuation. The party could not carry enough food from Truckee Lake to support 27 people through every mile of the crossing, without help from provisions left ahead. The intended rhythm was simple: travel to a cache, recover food, feed the group, continue toward the next point, and, eventually, the lower staging areas, where animals and greater supplies could assist them. That system allowed the second relief to leave the camps with 17 emigrants. It also meant that the party's safety depended upon food it was not carrying and could not see. A cache existed only as long as it could be found and its contents remained usable. Snow could conceal its location. Weather could alter the appearance of the route. Animals could disturb what had been stored. A party moving slowly might consume more food before reaching it than the rescuers had expected. Each of those risks was manageable by itself. Together, they narrowed the margin supporting the evacuation. The group moved west, expecting the route to provide what had been prepared for it. For a time, the system still seemed workable. The rescuers rationed what they carried and tried to preserve enough strength among the emigrants to reach the stored provisions. The travelers followed the snowshoe path, their movement marked by blankets shifting around their shoulders and by the repeated stopping and starting of tired bodies. The mountains offered no single pace. One slope could be crossed with care. The next might require the rescuers to spread out along the line, helping people whose legs no longer lifted easily through the snow. A short distance on the map could consume much of the day. As the hours passed, the difference between distance traveled and strength remaining began to widen. The party was moving closer to California. That much was true. Truckee Lake lay farther behind them with every westward step. Yet physical progress did not necessarily mean that the group was becoming safer. Food was being consumed. Clothing was becoming damp. The weakest emigrants were tiring faster than the landscape was changing. The rescuers were spending their own strength supporting others, while still carrying supplies and managing the route. The larger westbound company had created exactly the opportunity the second relief had hoped for. 17 people were out of the camps and moving toward California. It had also created a burden the party could not easily reduce. They could not increase their speed without leaving weaker travelers behind. They could not stop for long without using more food and exposing everyone to the cold. They could not divide casually, because smaller groups would lose rescuers, supplies, and the protection offered by numbers. So they continued as one uneven body, stretching and contracting across the snow. At times, the front of the line had to wait while those behind caught up. At others, rescuers moved backward along the trail to assist someone whose steps had slowed. Wet flakes settled into clothing during each pause. When movement resumed, stiffened fabric shifted against cold skin. The supplies grew lighter as they were used, but the journey did not feel lighter. The party's dependence upon the caches became more obvious with every ration distributed. Food stored ahead was no longer a useful addition to what they carried. It was becoming necessary, and at least some of those provisions would not be found in the condition the rescuers expected. Caches along the return route had been disturbed or emptied. What had once been placed carefully for future use could no longer be treated as certain. The party would reach places where food should have been waiting and discover that the journey's calculations no longer matched what remained on the ground. That failure would not be visible from a distance. The group could approach a known stopping place believing relief was only a few steps away. Only after reaching it would the absence become clear. By then, the food already carried would have been reduced by another day of travel. The wind continued to rise. Snow moved across the trail and gathered on the travelers. The distinction between the strongest and weakest members of the company became sharper, though everyone remained exposed to the same weather. The rescuers could still guide the group west. They could help people stand, adjust blankets, and distribute what remained. What they could not do was replace provisions that were no longer waiting where the plan required them to be. Between approximately March 5th and March 7th, the weather closed around the second relief. The storm caught the party before it could reach secure lower ground. The line that had left Truckee Lake with 17 emigrants slowed, then stopped near Summit Valley. They were closer to California than they had been on March 3rd, but with food disappearing, caches failing, and snow gathering around them, the distance still ahead had become harder to cross than the distance already behind. The storm did not create a shelter. It created the need for one. Near Summit Valley, the people who could no longer continue gathered where they could maintain a fire and gain some protection from the wind. There were no cabin walls waiting for them, no roof prepared against the snow, and no settled camp arranged for a long stay. This was only a stopping place, forced upon the second relief by weather, exhaustion, and the disappearance of the food on which its return plan depended. Brush had to serve where timber walls did not. The rescuers and emigrants gathered what they could and kept the fires alive. Wet branches smoked before they burned. Melted snow dampened the ground nearest the heat. Blankets were drawn close around bodies that had already spent days moving through cold. Beyond the small circle of firelight, the storm continued across the open snow. The place would later be known as Starved Camp. The name can make it sound like a destination marked in advance, but it was nothing of the kind. No one had left Truckee Lake intending to stop there. It was an emergency position, created when movement failed. The group had expected food caches along the route. At least some had been emptied or disturbed by animals, and the provisions carried from the mountain camps were exhausted. Without food, every delay became more serious. A person resting beside the fire was no longer using strength to walk, but rest alone could not restore what hunger had taken away. The emigrants needed warmth, yet maintaining warmth required constant work. Brush had to be found. Fires had to be protected from wind and snow. Blankets had to remain as dry as possible, though dampness gathered from the weather, the ground, and melting snow near the flames. The smoke stayed low at times, moving around the people before the wind carried it away. It entered clothing and blankets, adding another layer to the cold smell of snow and wet brush. Those nearest the fire gained some warmth. Those farther away felt more of the storm. Everyone depended upon the small area the rescuers could keep alive. The second relief now faced a decision more difficult than the choices made inside the cabins. The westbound party could no longer move as one body. Some people still had enough strength to continue with help. Others had reached a point where asking them to travel immediately might leave them unable to move at all. The weather narrowed every option. James Reed and Hiram Miller continued west with Patty and Thomas Reed. The children could not simply be expected to keep pace through the storm. Reed and Miller carried them onward, using their own remaining strength to move the children closer to the lower country. This decision gave Patty and Thomas a path west, but it also divided the rescuers and the people under their care. Many of the weaker emigrants remained behind at the makeshift camp. There was no clean separation between success and failure. Reed had reached his children and was now carrying them toward California. At the same time, the larger evacuation he had helped lead had broken apart in the mountains. People who had left Truckee Lake believing they were on their way out now found themselves stranded again, this time without the cabins that had sheltered them through the winter. The distance between the original camps and California had produced a third location of crisis. At Truckee Lake and Alder Creek, people still waited for another relief party. At Starved Camp, emigrants who had already been reached were now waiting to be reached again. Farther west, Reed, Miller, Patty, and Thomas continued toward help. The rescue had divided into 3 separate movements. One part was still descending. One part had stopped. One part remained behind at the original mountain settlements. That division reveals why the relief journeys cannot be understood as simple trips in and out. Each crossing changed the location and condition of the people involved. A party might remove emigrants from one danger, only to encounter another farther along the route. Supplies placed for future use might disappear. Weather might make a reasonable plan impossible within a day. At Starved Camp, the immediate task was not to complete the journey. It was to remain alive long enough for assistance to arrive. The people there had brush, maintained fires, blankets, and the shelter offered by the surrounding snow. These things were limited, but they formed the difference between complete exposure and a small defended space in the storm. The camp existed only because people continued feeding the fires and keeping close to what warmth could be preserved. Time passed differently there. At the lake cabins, the emigrants had known where they were and had some sense of the shelters around them. At this stopping place, the route itself had become the camp. The westward trail lay beneath fresh snow. The distance ahead was uncertain. The food expected along the way was no longer dependable. The storm between approximately March 5 and March 7 had stopped the second relief near Summit Valley, but the weather was only part of what held the group there. Exhaustion and hunger had reduced the ability to move, even when movement became possible again. The people beside the fire needed food before they needed distance. That fact would shape the next expedition. News of the second relief's condition had to move west with those who could still travel. The California settlements now faced a more complicated emergency than before. Another party would have to enter the Sierra, reach the stranded group near Summit Valley, and still consider the people remaining at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek. The next rescuers could not simply follow the original plan. They would have to divide their effort. While smoke continued to rise from the brush fires at Starved Camp, men farther west began preparing to turn back toward the mountains. Among them were William Eddy and William Foster, whose journey east would become the third relief. Eddy and Foster were not entering the mountains as distant volunteers responding to a general emergency. People connected to them remained somewhere ahead. That personal connection gave the third relief a clear purpose, but the expedition could not be organized around one family or one camp alone. The situation in the Sierra had changed. The next party was not simply trying to reach Truckee Lake. It first had to find the people stranded along the return route, bring them food, and decide whether enough rescuers could continue east toward those still waiting at the original settlements. William Eddy and William Foster became the principal leaders of this third effort. They gathered provisions and turned back toward ground that earlier parties had already crossed in both directions. The route was more familiar now, but familiarity did not make it dependable. Snow-covered tracks, weather-altered landmarks. Each report from the mountains described conditions that had already changed by the time the information reached California. The third relief, therefore, traveled toward more than one uncertainty. Somewhere near Summit Valley, people from the second relief remained beside brush fires, with little strength and no secure food supply. Farther east, the shelters at Truckee Lake still held survivors. Beyond the lake, the Donner families remained at Alder Creek. Each group required help, but the same provisions and the same rescuers could not be used in all places at once. The men climbed with food on their backs, moving again from lower ground into the whiteness of the Sierra. Snowshoes pressed across surfaces marked by wind and thaw. The air shifted between stillness and cold movement. In brighter stretches, the snow reflected enough light to narrow the eyes and flatten the landscape, making distance difficult to judge. The packs gave every step a purpose. Food was not merely part of the equipment this time. It was the first requirement of the people waiting at starved camp. The third relief could not ask them to move west until they had been fed. Reaching them without provisions would offer companionship but little practical change. The rescuers therefore carried the immediate means of restoring movement. As they approached the area where the second relief had stopped, the first sign of the camp may have been smoke rather than shelter. A low fire among the snow and brush would have been easier to distinguish than the people gathered around it. There were no cabins to announce the location, only a temporary space maintained against the cold. The smell of smoke reached across the clean mountain air. Then the figures beside the fires became clearer. What the third relief found was not a company prepared to resume its journey at once. The people at starved camp had been held there by hunger and exhaustion as much as by the earlier storm. Their blankets, brush, and fires had helped preserve life, but they had not restored the strength required for travel. The rescuers had brought the one thing capable of changing that condition. Food could now be distributed, though it still had to be handled carefully. People weakened by deprivation could not simply be treated as ordinary travelers receiving an ordinary meal. The provisions had to serve the immediate camp and preserve enough capacity for whatever movement followed. The arrival of the third relief created relief in the most literal sense. The stranded emigrants were no longer waiting without support. Yet once again, reaching people did not settle the larger question. The expedition now stood at a point where its purpose had to divide. If every rescuer remained at starved camp, the people there would have more assistance, but no one would continue toward Truckee Lake or Alder Creek. If the whole party pressed east, the weakened emigrants already found would be left with food, but without enough help to move safely west. Neither choice could satisfy every need, so the third relief separated its work. John Stark and others would remain with the people at starved camp. Their task was to feed them, help restore what strength could be restored, and guide them toward California. Eddie, Foster, and the remaining rescuers would continue deeper into the Sierra. This was the central decision of the third journey. The party did not divide because the emergency had become smaller. It divided because the emergency had spread across too much ground to be handled in one movement. The people beside the brush fires needed immediate assistance. The people at the lake and Alder Creek could not be allowed to disappear from the effort simply because another crisis had developed along the trail. The rescue now moved in two directions from one point. One group would prepare to face west, toward lower country and the possibility of eventual horses and settlements. The other would face east, toward the summit and the original camps. The exact dating of every movement during these days differs slightly among the surviving accounts. The safest chronology places the third relief's central actions between March 12 and March 14th. Within that range, the sequence remains clear. The party reached starved camp, delivered food, and divided its effort before part of the group continued toward Truckee Lake. That sequence matters more than assigning a single unquestioned date to every stop. Around the fires, the arrival of food changed what had been possible only hours earlier. People who had been waiting in near stillness could begin preparing for movement. Blankets could be adjusted. Portions could be distributed. Rescuers could assess who might stand, who would need close support, and how slowly the westbound group would have to travel. Meanwhile, the eastbound men tightened their packs and prepared to leave. The separation must have been visible in the simplest way. One set of rescuers remained near the smoke and brush. Another gathered what it could carry and turned back toward the higher snow. No one at that moment could claim the work was complete. The third relief had reached the emergency created by the second, but the shelters beyond the summit were still waiting. Every mile traveled east would reduce the number of men available at starved camp. Every man left behind would reduce the strength of the party continuing toward the lake. The solution was imperfect, because every available solution was imperfect. John Stark and those beside him stayed with the people already found. Eddie and Foster continued east. Behind them, food was being placed into weakened hands beside the low fires of starved camp. Ahead, beyond the glare of the snow, the cabins at Truckee Lake and the rough shelters at Alder Creek remained silent and unseen. John Stark remained beside the fire, while Eddie and Foster's smaller party moved east. For a little while, both groups were visible from the same patch of snow. One faced toward California with people too weak to travel without help. The other faced toward the summit, carrying what provisions could be spared for the camps beyond it. Then distance and the uneven ground began to separate them. The eastbound rescuers diminished into dark figures against the white slope. At Starved Camp, Stark's work began with food. The provisions brought by the Third Relief had to be distributed carefully among people whose bodies had been weakened by hunger. Warm food held in cold hands offered an immediate comfort, but it was also preparation for movement. The stranded emigrants could not remain beside the brush fires indefinitely. They needed enough strength to stand, balance themselves, and begin traveling west. That change could not be hurried. Eating did not restore weeks of lost strength in a single meal. A person who could sit upright near the fire might still be unable to support his or her weight for long. Someone might stand with assistance and then need to sit again. Stark and the men who stayed with him had to observe these differences and organize the group around them. The fires still required attention. Damp brush produced more smoke than heat until it began to burn properly. Snow melted at the edges of the small camp, and dampened blankets laid too close to the ground. Wind moved through the open country beyond the fire, reminding everyone that this was not a secure shelter, only a place where warmth had been maintained through effort. The rescuers gathered fuel, protected the flames, and helped arrange the people around them. Blankets were adjusted. Snowshoes were tightened and tested. Food packs were divided between what would be consumed before departure and what had to remain for the trail. Every preparation had two purposes. It helped someone recover in the present, and it made possible the next westward step. The people at Starved Camp had already attempted this journey once. They had left Truckee Lake believing the caches and rescuers would carry them toward safety. Now they were being asked to begin again from a place where the first attempt had stopped. The route ahead was still covered with snow. The bodies attempting it were weaker than when they had left the cabins. What had changed was the presence of men willing to remain beside them and make the next movement possible. Stark and the others could not remove the distance to California. They could reduce the burden of crossing it. They helped people rise from the blankets and fires. They steadied those whose legs no longer responded with confidence. They adjusted the order of travel so the stronger emigrants could move without leaving the weaker ones isolated. A rescuer might support one person for several steps, then turn to help another over the same ground. The line formed slowly. There was no sharp moment when Starved Camp ceased to be a camp and became a trail again. People stood one by one. Blankets were wrapped and lifted. Packs were settled onto shoulders. The fires continued burning, while the first travelers tested their balance in the snow. Some could move with guidance. Others required more direct help. The pace had to remain slow enough that no one was separated from the group or exhausted within the first stretch. This was rescue in its least dramatic and most demanding form. There was no single arrival to mark success. Progress came through repeated physical acts, offering food, lifting someone to a standing position, steadying a shoulder, breaking a short section of trail, and returning to help the next person cross it. Each mile west had to be assembled from those smaller efforts. The decision to leave men at Starved Camp now showed its value. Had every rescuer continued east, the stranded emigrants might have received food, but lacked the assistance needed to move. Provisions alone could not guide them through deep snow. The human work of the rescue began after the food had been delivered. At the same time, Stark knew that the men who had continued toward Truckee Lake faced their own reduced capacity. The Third Relief had divided its strength because the emergency had divided itself. The westbound rescuers were responsible for people already found. The eastbound party was responsible for those who remained beyond the summit. Neither group could wait for the other before beginning its work. As Stark and his companions prepared the emigrants for movement toward California, Eddie and Foster continued across the higher country. Their packs were lighter after leaving food at Starved Camp, but fewer rescuers now shared the remaining burden. The distance between the two groups widened. Behind Eddie and Foster, smoke from the emergency camp sank lower against the snow until it was difficult to distinguish from the gray air. Ahead, the route climbed toward Truckee Lake and then toward Alder Creek, where another set of choices waited. At Starved Camp, the first branch of the Third Relief had changed the direction of the stranded emigrants. They were no longer merely waiting beside the fires. With food, assistance, and Stark's men around them, they could begin moving west once more. The second branch continued east, toward people who had not yet received that help. Beyond the summit were families who had spent additional weeks in cabins, tents, and lean-to shelters. Among them were the youngest Donner children, waiting at Alder Creek in a camp separated from the lake by roughly 6 miles of winter ground. The 6 miles between Truckee Lake and Alder Creek were short on a map and difficult in the snow. Eddie, Foster, and the remaining rescuers had already crossed the summit, reached the lake area, and continued toward the second group of shelters. Around March 13th, they arrived where the Donner families had passed the winter apart from the main camp. Alder Creek offered less protection than the cabins beside the lake. The families had lived beneath tents and rough lean-to structures, with canvas, timber, blankets, and the shape of the ground providing what shelter they could. Snow surrounded the camp. Cold entered wherever wind found an opening. The weak warmth of a fire had to serve people who had been wading through the same winter with fewer solid walls around them. Here, the rescuers found Frances, Georgia, and Eliza Donner. They were the 3 youngest Donner girls. Simon Murphy was also among those the Third Relief would remove from the mountain camps. Their names turned the expedition's purpose into a series of immediate physical questions. Could they stand? Could they walk? How much food could they take before beginning? And if one of the children could not continue, who would carry her? The rescuers had already left part of their party at Starved Camp. Fewer men now remained to guide the people leaving Alder Creek and Truckee Lake. Every person selected for departure increased the work of the westward return. For the children, preparation began with small things. Blankets had to be arranged around them. Clothing had to be adjusted for movement outside the shelter. Food had to be given carefully. The objects within the camp were simple and worn: canvas, bedding, children's garments, and the remaining materials that had helped the families endure the winter. Eliza Donner would later remember her mother dividing hardened tallow into very small portions for the children. It was a memory recorded long afterward, from an experience she had lived through as a young child. It should not be treated like Patrick Breen's daily diary, or like an adult eyewitness account written at the time. Yet the image she preserved is specific. Small pieces of hardened fat, carefully divided because little remained to divide. The detail belongs to memory, but it gives form to the scale of the family's resources. A large supply can be measured by sacks, barrels, or animals. At Alder Creek, food had come to be measured in portions small enough to rest in a child's hand. The arrival of the Third Relief changed that condition, though only temporarily. The rescuers brought provisions, but the food was also needed for travel. What could be eaten at the shelter had to be balanced against what the children and adults would require on the route west. Departure, therefore, had to begin before strength was fully restored. Frances, Georgia, and Eliza were wrapped and prepared to leave the camp. Simon Murphy would go with the group as well. Around them, the rough shelters remained where they had stood through the winter, low against the snow and open in places to the cold air. For the older travelers, the rescuers could judge movement by watching a person stand and take several steps. Eliza presented a different problem. She was too young and too weak to walk the full distance out of the mountains. She would have to be carried. That decision altered the journey for everyone around her. A rescuer carrying a child could no longer use both hands freely for balance, supplies, or assistance to another traveler. The child's weight had to be added to the effort of every slope and every mile. Blankets had to provide warmth without becoming too heavy or awkward. When the rescuer tired, the group might need to stop or transfer the burden. Eliza's small size made carrying possible. It did not make it easy. Strong adults had already been exhausted by the Sierra while carrying only packs. Now a weakened child had to be moved across the same terrain by men whose numbers had been reduced at starved camp and whose own strength had been spent over repeated crossings. The rescue was becoming more personal and more physical with every stage. At Johnson's ranch, the work had been measured in beef, flour, saddles, and horses. At Mule Spring, it had been measured in pack weight. At Truckee Lake, it had been measured in the number of people who could be selected for departure. At Alder Creek, it could be measured in the weight of one bundled child. The 3 Donner girls and Simon Murphy represented people who could now be removed from the camps. Their departure also showed the limits of that success. The rescuers could take only those they believed they could guide or carry. The people remaining would still depend upon later help. Around March 13th, the third relief began turning west with Francis, Georgia, Eliza, and Simon. The children left the tents and lean-to shelters behind. Blankets moved against cold air. Snowshoes were tightened. Provisions were gathered. One rescuer took Eliza into his arms or onto his back, placing her weight above the snow so that her own legs would not have to carry her through every mile. The group now faced the route it had just crossed in the opposite direction. Truckee Lake lay between Alder Creek and the higher passage west. Beyond it waited the summit, the site where Stark and the others were guiding people away from starved camp, and the long descent toward California. The third relief had reached the children. The next test was whether it could keep carrying them. Carrying Eliza meant adjusting the journey to a burden that could not be asked to help carry itself. The rescuer holding her had to move carefully enough to keep his balance while protecting the child from the cold. Her blankets shifted with every step. Clothing stiffened in the mountain air. When soft snow collapsed beneath a snowshoe, the weight in his arms moved suddenly, and he had to steady both himself and the child before continuing. Eliza could be transferred when another man had strength to take her, but every transfer required a pause. Arms had to change position. Blankets had to be gathered again. The child had to remain covered while the rescuers adjusted their footing and loads. Around her, the others moved according to their own limits. Francis and Georgia Donner, Simon Murphy, and the additional survivors brought from the mountain camps followed with guidance and assistance. Some could maintain a slow pace on the broken trail. Others needed a hand at difficult places or time to recover after a climb. The group advanced not at the pace of the men who had crossed east with food, but at the pace of those now leaving after months of weakness. The third relief's return was therefore a different expedition from its approach. Going east, the rescuers had carried provisions and uncertainty. Going west, they carried people whose needs were now visible. A pack could be shifted without complaint. A child had to be kept warm. A sack could be placed in the snow during a halt. A weakened traveler might not be able to rise again without help. Each pause consumed time, but refusing to pause could consume strength that could not be replaced. The safest chronology places the central actions of the third relief between March 12 and March 14th, though the surviving accounts do not agree precisely on the date of every arrival, departure, and movement. The sequence is clearer than the individual days. The rescuers reached starved camp with food. The party divided. Stark and others remained to assist the people stranded there. Eddie, Foster, and the men continuing east reached the main camps and began bringing additional survivors west. Now those separate efforts moved toward one another. Somewhere along the route, the people helped by Stark were making their way toward California, while the party from Truckee Lake and Alder Creek approached from the opposite side of the same emergency. The two branches did not need to reunite in one formal moment for their work to belong to the same operation. One branch restored movement to people who had already left the cabins once. The other removed people who had remained behind. Together, they turned the third relief into two rescues carried out across the same stretch of snow. At stopping places, food was divided again. Travelers rested close to what warmth could be made. Snow softened beneath repeated footsteps and hardened again as the air cooled. The rescuers checked blankets, helped survivors stand, and rearranged the group before moving on. Eliza remained dependent upon the strength of the adults carrying her. A bundled child may appear light compared with the heavy flour and beef packs of the first relief, but provisions become lighter as they are consumed. A child remains a living responsibility through every mile. Her weight shifted when the trail sloped. Her blankets had to be held clear of the snow. The rescuer carrying her still needed to watch his own footing and follow the path broken by the men ahead. Slow breathing, stiff arms, and careful steps replaced the steady rhythm of carrying an ordinary pack. The farther west the group moved, the more the snow route began to connect with the staging system established by the earlier parties. Mule Spring lay ahead as the place where animal travel could again become possible. Below that point, horses could reduce the physical burden placed upon both rescuers and survivors. Until then, the work remained human. People were lifted, guided, supported, and carried. The distance was crossed through accumulated effort, rather than one decisive act. A person reached the next stopping place because someone had stayed beside them through the previous mile. This was the quiet accomplishment of the third relief. It had entered the mountains to answer two emergencies at once. It had brought food to those stranded by the second relief, left John Stark and others to help them west, then continued to Truckee Lake and Alder Creek for people still waiting there. Its success did not come from keeping the party together. It came from dividing at the correct moment and allowing each group to perform a different task. As the survivors descended, the mountain camps emptied further. The children carried away from Alder Creek left behind the shelters in which they had passed the winter. The people guided from Starved Camp left behind the brush fires that had preserved a narrow space against the storm. The route west held both groups now, moving by stages toward lower country. When the snow finally became less dominant and animals could once again assist, the shape of the journey changed. Children and weakened adults could be helped toward horses. Rescuers who had carried human weight across the higher route could loosen their grip and allow saddles and animal strength to take part of the burden. The third relief had completed its double operation, yet completion did not bring certainty. Reports reaching California could describe the people removed, but they could not prove that every living person had been found. Truckee Lake and Alder Creek had been visited repeatedly, but information remained imperfect, and time continued to pass after the third relief left. The mountains were beginning to move toward spring. Snow settled and changed. Days lengthened. Routes that had resisted horses in February would not remain exactly the same forever. Several weeks passed. In California, one quiet question remained. Were the camps truly empty, or had someone survived after the last rescuers turned west? On April 13th, another party left Johnson's ranch to find the answer. The men leaving Johnson's ranch on April 13th were entering a different Sierra from the one the first relief had faced in early February. Spring had begun to alter the lower country. Mud replaced some of the winter hardness. Water moved more freely along the route. Leather, buckles, saddles, and provisions were prepared in air that no longer carried the same depth of cold. Yet the higher mountains still held snow, and the purpose of the journey remained uncertain. William O. Fallon's expedition would later be remembered as the Fourth Relief. The name places it naturally beside the three parties that had carried food into the Sierra and brought weakened emigrants west. But this final crossing was not identical to those earlier efforts. The first 3 relief parties had entered while large numbers of people were known to be stranded. Their central problem was immediate and human: reach the camps, distribute food, decide who could travel, and guide or carry survivors toward California. By April, that emergency had diminished. Several groups had already been removed. The lake cabins and the shelters at Alder Creek had been visited repeatedly. The last reliable reports suggested that few, if any, people remained alive in the mountains. But reliable did not mean complete. Information had always moved slowly across the Sierra. A report described conditions as they had been days earlier. People separated between Truckee Lake and Alder Creek could be missed. Someone too weak to leave with one party might still survive after that party departed. So the possibility of finding a living emigrant remained. Property remained as well. The camps contained belongings left behind when families had been unable to move them. Household goods, clothing, books, equipment, and other possessions still lay in or around the shelters. Some items could be carried out. Others could be gathered, dried, packed, or cached for later recovery. The 4th Relief was organized around both purposes. Its men would search the camps for anyone still alive. They would also recover property, and members of the expedition had been promised a share of property successfully brought back. That arrangement changes the character of the journey. It does not remove its place among the 4 numbered relief parties. Fallon's men did enter uncertain country, where a survivor might still be found, and they would ultimately bring one living emigrant west. But the party was not traveling only as a rescue expedition. Financial interest and property recovery were part of its documented work from the beginning. At Johnson's ranch, the preparations therefore carried a quieter and more complicated meaning. A pack saddle might hold food for men searching the abandoned camps. It might later carry books, cloth, shoes, kitchen articles, or other goods found there. Paper arrangements concerning recoverable property stood beside the practical equipment of mountain travel. The sounds were familiar: leather pulled through buckles, metal fittings touched and tested, provisions placed into packs. But the questions surrounding those preparations were different. The 1st Relief had asked how much food 7 men could carry to people known to be starving. The 4th Relief asked what and whom might still be found. No one preparing to leave could know whether the party would encounter survivors, only empty shelters, or property scattered through camps already altered by weather and time. The men were traveling toward silence rather than direct reports. That silence created room for assumption. The camps might be empty because everyone living had already been removed. They might contain someone missed by the earlier parties. They might preserve objects whose owners had died or reached California without them. The expedition could not know which answer waited beyond the summit. Its provisions had to support a search whose human result might be nothing at all. Its packs had to remain capable of carrying recovered goods. Its members had to enter places where the rescue story and the property arrangements could not always be separated cleanly. By mid-April, even the landscape encouraged a different kind of expectation. The route was no longer held entirely in the fixed shape of deep winter. Snow varied with elevation and exposure. Water worked beneath it. Lower trails softened. The mountain was beginning to release what it had concealed, though unevenly and without certainty. This made travel more possible in some places and less predictable in others. The 4th Relief would still have to abandon animal travel where snow became too difficult. Men would still carry provisions on foot, but they were not following the exact conditions of February, and they should not be imagined as repeating the 1st Relief step for step. They were entering the same geography at another moment in the season, for a purpose that combined mercy, uncertainty, and material recovery. That combination is why 4 relief journeys describes the sequence more accurately than 4 identical rescues. The 1st Relief had opened the route. The 2nd had attempted a larger evacuation and created the emergency at Starved Camp. The third had divided itself between stranded travelers and the original camps. The fourth would search what remained after all three. At Johnson's ranch, the final packs were secured. Saddles and supplies were made ready. The men understood that the camps might yield no living person. They also understood that they could not know without crossing the mountains again. So on April 13th, William O. Fallon's party left the ranch and turned east. Behind them lay spring mud, ranch buildings, and the settled country of California. Ahead were the lake cabins, Alder Creek, uncertain snow, and whatever the abandoned camps had not yet surrendered. The first miles carried Fallon's party through ground softened by spring. Mud gathered around hooves. Water ran beside the trail and beneath patches of old snow. During the day, the air could feel milder than it had in February, but warmth did not remain after sunset. Cold returned quickly in the higher country, hardening wet surfaces and stiffening leather that had softened during the climb. The horses could still carry provisions through the lower stretches. Their loads included enough food for the men to continue searching the mountain camps. Pack saddles shifted as the route rose, and branches dripped onto clothing and equipment. Snow appeared first in broken patches, then spread more continuously across the ground. As before, the animals eventually reached country where they could no longer be useful. Fallon's account describes the men removing the saddles and leaving them hanging in trees. The horses were sent back while the party prepared to continue on foot with 10 days of provisions. The empty saddles remained above the trail, suspended from branches over snow and wet ground. It was a practical arrangement. Leather and equipment left directly on the earth would be exposed to water, mud, and melting snow. Hanging the saddles kept them visible and offered some protection until the men returned. The scene also marked the same essential change faced by the earlier relief parties. Animal power ended. Human carrying began. The fourth relief had entered later in the season, but spring had not cleared one continuous road across the Sierra. Conditions changed sharply from place to place. Snow might be reduced on an exposed slope and remain much deeper in shaded or higher ground. A crust might hold a man's weight for several steps, then collapse beneath the next. Fallon's report describes widely varying depths along the route. No single measurement can represent the entire crossing. What mattered to the men was the unevenness. They walked across snow softened by daytime warmth, then encountered firmer surfaces where the cold had preserved the crust. Meltwater moved beneath parts of the snowpack. Branches released drops whenever the air warmed. Provisions shifted as the men adjusted their footing through each new condition. The 10 days of food gave the party a limit as well as support. Every day spent reaching and searching the camps reduced what remained for the return. If a survivor were found, the provisions would have to support one more person. If valuable property were recovered, its weight would compete with food and equipment for space on human backs. The men could not know which burden they would carry west. They continued toward Truckee Lake through a landscape that was becoming less uniformly white, but no less uncertain. Trees, exposed ground, and moving water appeared more often than they had during the earlier crossings. Yet the higher route still held the winter firmly enough to slow every step. On April 17th, 4 days after leaving Johnson's ranch, Fallon's party reached the lake cabins. The shelters were familiar from earlier reports, but the atmosphere around them had changed. No group of waiting emigrants came forward to meet the rescuers. No crowded movement filled the low interiors. The fires that had once required constant attention were no longer signs of an occupied settlement. The men entered a place believed to have been abandoned. Objects remained where people had left them or where weather had shifted them. The cabins still held evidence of the winter, but not an immediate answer to the question that had brought the party across the mountains. Silence could mean that the earlier relief journeys had removed everyone still alive. It could also mean that someone remained elsewhere, unable to reach the cabins or respond to the men entering them. So the fourth relief began to search. The lake area had to be examined carefully. Alder Creek lay about 6 miles away, and could not be treated as part of the same location. Each shelter, path, and remaining sign had to be considered separately. The men had reached the camps, but arrival did not settle whether their journey would become a rescue, a recovery expedition, or both. They searched through April 17 and the days that followed, moving among shelters altered by snow, thaw, and abandonment. Then, on April 19th, the silence finally gave way to one living person. Louis Keseberg was still in the mountains. Keseberg's presence answered the first question of the Fourth Relief. The camps were not entirely empty. On April 19th, Fallon's party found him alive among shelters and belongings left behind after the earlier evacuations. He was the only living emigrant the Fourth Relief would bring out of the mountains. Around him, the camp held the remains of ordinary life interrupted and abandoned. Books had been left where damp air and melting snow could reach them. Cloth lay among household articles. Tea and coffee remained with shoes, percussion caps, and kitchen items that had once belonged to families expecting to carry such things into California. Now those objects were examined for another journey. The men gathered what could be moved. Some property had to be dried before it could be packed. Other items could be bundled, cached, or placed with the provisions carried by the party. Paper, cloth, leather, and metal had endured the winter differently. Damp pages could cling together. Fabric could hold moisture. Shoes and household goods carried the cold of the abandoned shelters. The search had therefore produced both of the results anticipated at Johnson's ranch. A survivor had been found. Property could be recovered. That combination made the Fourth Relief unlike the three crossings before it. The men were no longer deciding how many families could be led away from crowded camps. They were preparing one weakened survivor for the westward route, while also deciding how much property could be transported without overloading the party. Every recovered object added weight. A book or piece of cloth might seem small beside a sack of flour, but the loads accumulated. Tea, coffee, shoes, percussion caps, and kitchen articles all had to share space with the food and equipment needed for the return. The men had entered with 10 days of provisions. They could not allow recovered goods to displace what Keseberg and the rescuers required to reach California. The published account associated with Fallon later included darker and more sensational claims about what the party found and what Keseberg had done. Those accusations became part of the legend that followed him for the rest of his life. But they were disputed, including by Eliza Donner Houghton, and the most serious claims cannot be treated as established fact. There is no reliable basis here for declaring that Keseberg murdered Tamsen Donner, Lavina Murphy, or anyone else. The surviving record is complicated by accusation, denial, later retelling, and the appetite of 19th century readers for the most disturbing version of the story. The responsible course is to separate what the Fourth Relief clearly accomplished from what later accounts could not prove. Keseberg was found alive on April 19th. The party recovered and packed property. The men prepared to take him west. Those facts are enough to carry the journey forward. The immediate question was no longer what had happened in every abandoned shelter. It was whether the last survivor and the added loads could be moved safely back across the Sierra. Keseberg had spent longer in the mountain camps than any person already removed. Whatever strength remained had to be measured against the same route that had tested children, rescuers, and the earlier evacuation parties. Spring had changed the snow, but it had not removed the distance. The men still had to cross uneven ground, protect their food, carry recovered goods, and support a survivor whose condition could slow the entire party. During the day, softened snow could collapse beneath their steps. At night, cold could return, and harden wet clothing and crusted surfaces. The property could be set down during a halt. Keseberg could not be treated as another bundle. His movement would determine the pace. If he weakened, a rescuer would have to assist him. If the recovered loads became too heavy, something would have to be cached or abandoned. The men had found what they came to search for, but discovery was not completion. The cabins at Truckee Lake now stood behind them as the Fourth Relief prepared to leave. Books, cloth, tea, coffee, shoes, percussion caps, and household articles were gathered into loads. Provisions were checked. The route west was considered again, this time with one additional life depending upon it. Then Fallon's party turned away from the abandoned camps. Louis Kieseberg went with them. The last westward passage of the relief sequence had begun. The westward journey carried Fallon's party away from the silent cabins and back across the changing Sierra. Between April 19 and April 25th, the men moved through snow softened by spring days and hardened again by cold nights. Recovered property shifted in the packs. Kieseberg traveled with them as the only living emigrant brought out by the Fourth Relief. With each descent, the landscape became less severe. Snow gave way gradually to exposed earth, running water, and lower air that held more warmth. The equipment began to dry. The sounds of animals and occupied settlements returned. On April 29, 1847, Louis Kieseberg reached Sutter's fort. His arrival marked the end of the documented sequence. He was the last person removed alive from the mountain camps. The four relief parties had not performed the same task 4 times. The first relief had opened the winter route, reached Truckee Lake, and begun the first organized evacuation. The second relief, led by James F. Reed and others, had returned for people still waiting, including Patty and Thomas Reed. Its larger westbound group had been stopped by weather and failing provisions, creating the new emergency at Starved Camp. The third relief, led principally by William Eddy and William Foster, had answered 2 needs at once. John Stark and others remained with the people already stranded along the trail, while the rest continued toward Truckee Lake and Alder Creek for additional survivors. The Fourth Relief, under William O. Fallon, had entered later in the season with a mixed purpose. It searched for anyone still living and recovered property from the camps. It found Kieseberg and brought him west. That is why 4 relief journeys is more precise than imagining 4 identical rescues. The Donna Reed party was not saved by one arrival in the snow. The work unfolded through repeated crossings, each shaped by the consequences of the journey before it. Food carried east became strength for movement west. A failed cache changed the fate of an evacuation. Family ties brought rescuers back into the mountains. Physical weakness determined who could walk, who needed support, and who had to be carried. Nothing happened with complete information. The settlements rarely knew exactly who remained alive. The rescuers could not know how weather would change the route. The people inside the camps could not know when another party might appear. Decisions were made with limited food, uncertain reports, and the strength available in that moment. By the end of April, the crossings were finished. At Sutter's fort, the last survivor stood once more in settled California. Around him were buildings, animals, voices, and dry ground, the ordinary sounds of a world that had continued beyond the snow. Far to the east, the Sierra remained above the valley, still holding the abandoned shelters and the tracks of those who had crossed it again and again. But no living emigrant remained there, waiting for another relief party.